Hello and welcome to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Caroline Fisher, Associate Professor of Journalism at the University of Canberra. Hi Michelle.
Hi Caroline.
Another very busy week loaded with COVID. So we saw a rapid increase, rapid spread of COVID cases in New South Wales, and the state government has extended the Sydney lockdown by an extra 4 weeks. It's bringing in the military to help enforce tighter restrictions. It's all a bit grim. Let's start with some good news. I mean, in other parts of the country, restrictions have been lifted. So in South Australia, in Victoria, in regional areas, and Melbourne lifted. Does this reinforce that that message that locking down hard and fast is really the only way to go?
Well, that's right, unless you decide to live with a level of the virus, and we can't do that till we have many, many more people vaccinated. But of course, the New South Wales Premier has now come under a good deal of criticism for not going harder, faster, and there's a big catch-up operation underway. Whether it will catch up and reduce the virus to 0 new community cases in that month that we're now seeing the lockdown extended for, who knows?
There was, on Q&A last night, there were people living in the areas in Fairfield and other parts of Sydney under lockdown. They could hear the helicopters overhead. It was quite stressful. It felt like that there was tension rising in those areas. The presence of troops, do you think that will inflame the situation there? Is it the right thing to do?
It's been controversial because especially in Western Sydney with large ethnic communities, people who've come from places where a military presence is very threatening, people have questioned bringing in troops in that situation. However, given the shortage of resources, the difficulty of the situation, the argument on the other side is that the military presence is one way of getting the enforcement job done in an efficient manner. Seemed to work in Victoria, so we'll see how it goes in New South Wales. But I think that the Premier was under a lot of pressure to accept the federal offer to bring in troops.
So the other offer, of course, in response to all of this has been additional financial support, an increase in the COVID disaster payment, and additional support for those who already receive income support payments, and for those who've lost more than 8 hours of work in a week. I think that's correct. Is that right, Michelle? But he hasn't reinstated JobKeeper. Why is he so adamantly against reinstating JobKeeper?
Well, Scott Morrison says we're in a different situation to last year, that what you need is a more flexible scheme so that you can turn it on and off when there are limited outbreaks like we're seeing now. I think also we've seen that JobKeeper, while it was a highly effective and desirable scheme at the time, did in fact contain quite a lot of waste because a lot of money went to firms that in fact were not in need of it, as it turned out. But certainly the government's been quite adamant that it wants to have this more specific scheme, money paid directly to workers, although they're supposed to be retained by their employers, rather than the money going through the actual firms.
So there's been, again, this concern that, there's one rule for New South Wales, another for Victoria, that, different types of treatment there. Is there much in that argument, do you think?
Well, certainly we were hearing this a few weeks ago. That argument seems to have died down a bit. I think the Victorians, though, made their point fairly strongly. The government the moment is not just anxious to get out the money to keep people sustained, but it's also worried about the prospect of another recession.
Yeah.
The expectation now is that the September quarter will be negative. How the December quarter works out, the Treasurer has made it quite clear, is very much dependent on what happens in New South Wales, which of course is a very, very large slice of the overall national economy. So the funds, the large funds going out at the moment are very substantially directed to trying to keep the economy afloat in that December quarter and out of recession.
Okay, so a bit of a crystal ball gazing exercise here, I guess, but if there were a recession, what impact do you think that would have on the federal government's chances at the next poll?
Well, if there were a recession, it would be registered actually just before an election. We expect the election in March.
The recession would be registered,
yes,
you mean?
in March or May. And of course, there's a delay in the figures coming out. So I think the December quarter would be due out right at the start of March. That would be a big knock to the government, which has boasted, of course, about the V-shaped recovery from the earlier recession, and also the government has economic credentials at the heart of the pitch it makes to the electorate. However, people do differ about whether voters, in fact, if there were another recession, would turn against the government or would feel times are so uncertain that we're worried about making a change now. So the actual political implications, I think, would be unclear or are unclear at this stage. And of course, the government hopes, well, everyone hopes, we don't reach the recession stage anyway.
Yes, well, he's been saying that it'll all look different, by Christmas. I mean, it's wishful thinking, surely.
Depends very much on how the virus travels, frankly, but it's certainly optimistic thinking. The government believes that it will have the back of the vaccination task broken by then, but I think it won't be obviously entirely finished, and it depends what level we get to on vaccination. Today, the National Cabinet is considering advice from the Doherty Institute about what levels you need for enough community immunity that you can open up. But it's interesting that the government is also getting advice from Treasury, so it's looking at the economic impacts of opening at various levels of vaccination safety, as it were. And so it's not just looking at health advice on this, it's getting a mixture of advice. And how that melting pot goes, well, we'll see in the coming weeks. Scott Morrison has said this week he doesn't expect National Cabinet to make any decisions on its first day of consideration of this matter, but we'll see.
That is going to be fuel for a very heated debate, one would think.
Absolutely.
So with that election on the horizon, the Labor Party appears to have been shedding some of its policy baggage that caused damage at the last election. They've changed their position on negative gearing and they've supported the legislated tax cuts. It's quite a pragmatic approach.
Totally pragmatic.
Do you think it's going to alienate the left of the party, maybe cause a bit of disunity? And does that matter? Is it worth it? Is it worth the change?
Well, we haven't heard the left in the parliamentary party speaking out. Mind you, the left these days is defanged, as it were. It is very quiet on most things. I think at branch level, it'll probably alienate some in the party. There'll be a bit of a worry about, in those inner city seats, shedding votes to the Greens. But I think that
surely many of them will benefit from the tax cuts.
Well, that point is being made as well, that a lot of the Green supporters are actually quite prosperous. But leaving that cynicism aside, I think there is a bit of concern about that. On the other hand, there's the pragmatic judgment that most of those votes would come back in preferences anyway, and that Anthony Albanese really needs to pick up votes to appeal to the centre. That's where he needs to garner. So I believe this decision was a sensible one by the shadow cabinet, and of course it was endorsed by the caucus at a very rapidly called meeting on Monday, although it's been a matter of discussion for months and months and speculation as to how it would go. But it does show us again that Anthony Albanese is really absolutely determined to give the election a red-hot go. It's going to be his only chance to become Prime Minister, and if he has to shed some baggage on the way through, even alienate a few people in the party, he'll do so.
We have to remember, though, the review into their loss at the last election did actually recommend that they narrow their platform. This was, identified by the review team that the broad platform was a problem for the Labor Party.
Yes, and it was undoubtedly true that some of its policies which would have imposed taxes on people or changed tax arrangements so the burden became greater, while maybe justified in policy terms, did alienate some voters. And also there's a recognition that it went to the election with too many policies. It had policies on everything. Now that's going to be, I think, substantially narrowed. So there'll be a few messages and they will be unthreatening messages. But one message that it's very important that Anthony Albanese delivers well and strongly and makes sound convincing is the message on the exit from COVID, because by the time of the election, we're still going to be discussing that exit, and that's what voters in the moment will be particularly concerned with.
I thought you were going to say climate change there, that he had to be strong and convincing about his policy on climate change. I think that's still an unresolved area for the Labor.
Well, and that'll wait until after the Glasgow conference, of course, towards the end of the year. Yes, I do think he has to be convincing on that, and it's a difficult issue for Labor because of internal divisions, because of the different messages that often seem appropriate in different seats. But I think that the COVID challenges are probably harder to really get a policy around at the time than climate change will be.
So Parliament returns next week, but under quite restricted circumstances. What can we expect?
I think we'll see fewer members in the chambers. We'll certainly see fewer staff being brought, and the Parliament House is going to be closed to the public. So we'll see fewer lobbyists, or perhaps no lobbyists at all, more accurately.
And they're trying to restrict the politicians' movements about Canberra as well. I think they're sending them home with prepackaged dinners. Keeping them out of the restaurants.
So I'm certainly keeping them out of the restaurants. But some, of course, have been isolating here in this last couple of weeks anyway in preparation for the sitting. I don't know what the provisions are for them.
Okay. Oh, well, look forward to hearing all about it. Thanks again for all your insights, Michelle, and I look forward to speaking to you again in a fortnight.
Thanks, Caroline.